What's good, guys? It's Ruben back here with the third day of our Bible in 1 year. I know I'm a little late. I'm gonna get them done, but I'm also just letting you guys know how excited I am to share two little theories that I actually came up with at the end of Genesis chapter 11 that have to do with Terah and his son Abram. So, like we begin with all videos, I'm gonna start off with a devotional. We are in the day 3 devotional where it talks about Genesis and how the name for Genesis actually in the Hebrew is Rashit. Rashit simply means beginning. And so, also, like I said in the previous videos, we know Adam means humanity and Eve means life, and how both of these humans that were in the Garden of Eden are image bearers of God. So we learn that Adam and Eve clearly didn't trust God's explanation of what good and evil is. And that's where God is giving us the moral obligation to choose whether or not we trust in our own definition of good and evil, or if we trust in what he says is good and evil. This is where we'll also learn the story of the Tower of Babel that's in Genesis chapter 11, and how it actually is shown the pride and arrogance of the people at the time that were trying to use their new technology, which was the brick, to make a name for themselves and to be prideful. And so God, in his mercy, he actually had split up their languages. We'll learn about that later, and how he split them up in order to have mercy on them. And it shows that God is still working with humans and wanting to keep them part of his plan and ultimate goal and purpose of getting to know them more and to have a close personal relationship with us. So we'll be going over Genesis chapters 8 through 11. And in 8, we learn that the flood waters are finally receding after the flood, and Noah is able to send out 2 birds in place to check and confirm that the flood waters are not only receding, but that they have fully dissipated. The first bird that he sends out is actually the raven, which is the largest of the crow family. And the raven, since it is a scavenger, was able to stay out the longest outside of the boat and fly around the entire time until the flood waters completely receded. And that's where the dove also comes out. And he is actually flown out 3 times, which I learned in my Bible college at Valor Christian College from my professor Sams. He said that 3 means completion. And those 2 times that Noah had retried to send out the dove, it actually shows that Noah waited 7 days each of those times. So 7 in the Hebrew also means perfection. So we learned from these 3 times, we see that the first one is where the waters are still covered, the dove comes back in. The second try, he has an olive tree within his beak. And so what an olive tree branch actually represents is that it represents prosperity, beauty, and divine blessing, which is what Noah was about to receive after leaving the boat. The last one is where the dove never returned, and that means that there is a place for humans to finally go back onto the earth and repopulate. We also learned that dove in the Hebrew culture of the Old Testament means peace and harmony. Also, the other thing that I've learned from my Bible app called the Filament Bible app teaches me that 40, which is the amount of days that Noah was waiting, 40 days associated with trial, affliction, or punishment. So the flood waters receding is also a similarity and a parallel to Genesis chapter 1 on the 3rd day, where God created land versus the waters that were on the earth. And this shows that God is literally creating a new creation. Now we learn in Genesis chapter 9, God is creating a new covenant with Noah. And also, in the case, there's also sin reintroduced later on. But in this new covenant, God is allowing animals and humans to coexist again, but humans are still at the top of the food chain, now having the ability to eat any kind of animal they want, as long as the lifeblood is not in it. So they would have to drain the blood out of the animal in order for them to eat it, to show the sanctity of all life. And that is why God had made that a law. So now with this newfound knowledge, animals are in terror of humans and they do not like to be around us, which is why you see birds fly away from us and all of these different animals that scurry away from us as much as possible. We also see that humans now have the ability to have acts of justice according to those that have been murdered. So it's kind of where the eye for an eye started before it was actually written in Leviticus. We also learn where the origin of the rainbow is, from the confirmation that God is never going to flood the earth again. So that's why he had put it in the clouds, because that is where the rain came and the judgment came down upon people. Another cool thing I learned from the Filament Bible app was that the bow was the representation of an actual like bow, like a bow and arrow, because the way the Mesopotamian knowledge of God is stated is that God is like a mighty warrior. And so he was shooting arrows, which would be considered the rain, down at the ground. So that way, when the bow was displayed, it showed that God was finally hanging his bow and no longer going to be using it to destroy humans, because the bow is an act of judgment in that time. So we also learn that Shem, Ham, and Japheth are the new repopulators of the earth, pretty much what Seth was to Adam in Noah's case. So now also we know that Ham is Canaan's father. It's repeated twice. So that means there's some very deep meaning behind that emphasis. We learned that after the case of Noah getting off the boat, he decided to cultivate a vineyard, create some wine, and then got drunk off of it, being naked inside of a tent and slept there. While Ham, his son, found him, and instead of covering his father's nakedness, he decided to expose it to his brothers, in which his brothers' case, they covered up their father in order to cover his shame. And then at this point, Noah wakes up flustered, realizing what Ham has done, and he ends up cursing him, saying that he will be the servant of his siblings, and actually that his son will be the servant of his siblings and his relatives. And so we learn Canaan is where we get the Canaanites, which is very crazy because all of this started from Genesis chapter 11, that the whole Israelites versus the Canaanites and all those ites in the Bible that we read when they're going into the promised land. All of this is connected from this point on. So now we read Genesis chapter 10. We learn about the descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, which, like I said, Ham is the father of Canaan, and Canaan is the ancestor of all the Canaanites that the Israelites fought within the books of Joshua and so on. Now we're in Genesis 11, where we talk about the Tower of Babel, which Babel literally means confusing word, or in the Hebrew, Balal means to confuse. And so in this case, humans are settling in Babylonia, where they are now trying to make a name for themselves by building a city and a great tower that reaches to the heavens to be as famous as they possibly can be. So God sees this and notices how strong they could become. And so what he does is that he confuses the languages among the people. And this is where we get all of our different languages from. And literally all of this just happens out of nowhere, where the people can't build the tower no more and everything goes haywire. Which is kind of funny, because if you don't realize it, like I read in my Filament app, it actually shows that this is a flashback of Genesis 10, because Genesis 10 is the scattering of all the people and where they're going into their different lands. And Genesis 11 is just showing how that happened. We also see in this Tower of Babel the stark contrast between Abram's humble obedience, which we'll see in Genesis 12, versus the nation's pride and arrogance in wanting to build themselves a name. And that's where we get Proverbs 16:18, where it says, pride comes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. So now we're introduced to Shem and his descendants, who are Terah all the way down to Abram. And we see Terah leaves Ur of the Chaldeans after his son Haran dies, most likely because of the grief that he was stricken when that happened. Eventually, Terah, his son Abram, Sarai, his daughter-in-law, and his grandson Lot end up settling in the land of Haran. And Terah ends up dying there. This is where we see in the last verses where Terah and Abram went to go to Haran, but Terah had died in Haran because he settled there, and where Abram is going to eventually go to Canaan. And so I'm going to end it there, just because I don't have a lot of time. But if anything, I'm going to share that theory in another video. So I just pray that you guys have been blessed by this. You have a wonderful day, and God bless you.